So for Freire, when we're talking about the objective transformation of reality, the only form of OTR that has any validity is a transformation with, right? It's a shared struggle. I have to share in that struggle. I cannot assume your burden and then transform reality for you. I cannot, like, I can't assume, and this is an actual good point, right? He doesn't talk about this specifically, but there's a concept, right, of assuming this burden for someone else. In contemporary African American literature and some post-colonial theory, you'll hear the phrase white man's burden, right? And the idea of white man's burden is that it is the responsibility, it is the burden of a good Samaritan in a sense, right? A good Samaritan, quote-unquote, white man, to assume the burden of the oppressed population, to sort of bear that burden for them. Freire is saying that's categorically false, right? You cannot assume my burden. You cannot assume the oppressor, and it doesn't have to be the white man, whoever the oppressor is, the educator, the professor, cannot assume my burden. I have to bear the blunt of that burden, and my people have to bear the blunt of that burden ourselves. And if you're going to struggle with us through converting, which I erased as well too, through converting and attempting to recognize the institution of oppression that has been implemented by members of the oppressed class, then you can struggle and attempt to transform this reality with me, but you can never do it for me, right? So Freire would categorically deny the notion of sort of an assumed burden. What he would say is that the burden can be shared, but the burden can never be assumed, right? So for Freire, it's a transformation with, right, not a transformation for. And as we said, this transformation with comes as a consequence of recognition. I have to, one, recognize you as a human being, right? We begin this process by my recognition that you are entitled to the same rights as I'm entitled to, that you are no different than I am, that you are co-facilitating in recreating your humanity and our humanity, right? That this process of recreation becomes shared. It's not something that I'm going to do for you, right? If it's something I do for you, then it becomes an act of false charity, an act of false generosity, and we're back to square one. Okay, so next he talks about the importance of struggle, right? And we've talked a lot about struggle in this discussion on Freire. The first thing is an acceptance of, and this is a quote, the struggle for humanization. This acceptance necessitates the responsibility for the struggle, right? So the struggle for humanization, right? So if we are oppressed, and here's the oppressor. If we are oppressed, and here's the oppressor, the struggle for humanization is an attempt to put me on par, right? I want to go here and then here, roughly. This attempt to elevate my status from a dehumanized state of affairs to a humanized state of affairs, from a dehumanized state of affairs to a humanized state of affairs is the process of struggle, right? Is a process of struggle. This idea of struggle, he says, the struggle for humanization, right? The struggle to be on par, the struggle for humanization necessitates the responsibility for the struggle. And what does that mean, this responsibility? There's a responsibility, right? There's an inherent responsibility for members of the oppressed group who are already oppressed to struggle for this recognition, right? You have to struggle for this recognition if you're not now recognized, because no one else is going to do it for you, right? You have to motivate yourself to want to be recognized as a peer, because if you don't want that recognition, you'll never gain it, right? So for Freire, there is a responsibility within members of the oppressed group, within members of the oppressed class, to struggle for this recognition, right? So this process of dehumanization and the transformation from a dehumanized state of affair to a humanized state of affair requires the responsibility to struggle, right? You're not going to be able to get it as an act of charity. You're not going to be able to get this recognition as an act of generosity. And if you think about it, it's true, right? You cannot have someone, you cannot force someone to recognize you for the person you want to be recognized for. If you think that people aren't appreciating you for who you are, if you think people aren't appreciating or respecting your talent or your contributions, then to sit back and do nothing, you will continue to be denied. What you have to do is struggle for that recognition, and it seems unfair. I'm already oppressed, now I have to struggle, but that's the point, right? Yes, the individuals who are already oppressed, the individuals who are already being denied, the individuals who are already being dehumanized and overlooked have to struggle for that recognition. And in struggling for that recognition, they regain the humanity that was robbed of them. So it's definitely uphill, I mean literally, conceptually rather. Conceptually, it is an uphill battle, right? It is a battle to be fought by those who are already oppressed. The importance of struggle also, in a second sense, is that we recognize that when we talk about oppression, right? When we talk about oppression and suppression, right? When we talk about objectification, when we talk about dehumanization, we recognize that oppression is death affirming, right? And I think this is a great statement, right? Oppression is death affirming. So I'll write that down. Oppression is death. Right? Oppression is death affirming. In an instance of willful oppression, I recognize that the consequence, a necessary consequence of that oppression is death, right? It is to hamper the development of a group, right? It is to exploit a group. It is to use a group or a member of a group as an object, right? In Kantian terms, and Kant specifically talks about this, right? It's a violation of his categorical imperative, right? We should always use individual human beings as an end. Right? You should always use an individual human being as an end and never as a means to some end. Right? We should never do this, we should do this. Right? You should always use a human being as an end in and of him or herself. And you should never use a human being as merely a means to get to something, right? And that's what this is saying, right? Oppression is death affirming. Insofar as I oppress an individual, I disregard who they are, because now they become object, right? They're nothing more than an object for me to get to what my end is. And if it means exterminating them, if it means committing acts of genocide or crimes against humanity in order to get to my end, so be it. In recognizing a human being as an end in and of themselves, I have to recognize the human being's humanity. Right? In failing to recognize a human being as an end and using them only as a means to an end, I inherently dehumanize. Right? So the process of dehumanization, to rephrase it yet again, is the intent or the attempt to use a human being as a means to an end rather than an end in and of him or herself. Okay. On a positive sense, however, if we know that oppression is death affirming, then we realize that this struggle for liberation, the struggle for affirmation, for recognition, is life affirming, right? So Freire says that struggle, G-L-E, is, right? Struggle is life affirming, right? The point of members of the oppressed group struggling for recognition is life affirming. It reinforces, it reestablishes the importance of recognizing human beings in and of themselves as human beings, right? It is a recognition at all times that we shouldn't use human beings as merely a means to an end.